This episode of The Candid Frame is brought to you by the Charcoal Book Club. Their carefully curated selections reflects the best in contemporary photography and all for a reasonable price, and they are delivered directly to your doorstep each month. They offer free shipping to the US, Canada, and the UK. It's subsidized elsewhere. It's a great way to begin or expand your photo library. Join the club at charcoalbookclub.com today, and remember to use the promo code TheCandidFrame at checkout. Photography was key in the creation of the U.S. National Park System. The photographs of Elliott Porter, Ansel Adams, and others showcase the beauty and the ecological importance of locations including Yellowstone Valley and the Grand Canyon. They helped to preserve these areas and made them popular destinations for visitors from all over the world. However, the importance of these areas can be easily lost when they are seen as nothing more than a picture opportunity. These lands are important to more than just visitors. They are critical to countless wildlife and fauna, as well as thousands of people for whom these areas are considered home. Lana Z Caplan's project, Oceano, explores how the famous dunes of Central California are important to different communities. ATV riders, Native Americans, and local residents value the same lands but for very different reasons, which has led to disagreements over land use for decades. Lana's work demonstrates how modern photography continues to tell the complex stories associated with this country's most valuable lands. This is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame. Well, Lana, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
You know, your book is, and the work that you do is very kind of interesting. You know, I see a lot of books about the sort of the landscape and about, you know, certain locations, be it in the United States or elsewhere. But it's really interesting in terms of how you sort of tackle the idea of how a place is used, claimed, identified by different groups of people. In this case, going back generations. And, you know, from reading, you initially weren't aware of all that when you moved out from the East Coast, and you were your curiosity was piqued by I think the photographs of Edward Weston that he had made there. God, 70, 80 years ago? Maybe
almost
longer.
100 now.
100 years ago? Well, okay.
Almost, the 1930s.
But tell me about, you know, those initial, you know, explorations of the area and what you came to learn about it and what led you to decide, oh, I want to make a photographic project about this.
Yeah, it was through Weston's pictures that I learned of the place. So I had been living in New York and Brooklyn, and I came out to California first just for a year, like as a temporary visiting professor, and I thought, you know, I'd go back to Brooklyn in a year. But I fell in love with California and decided to get a permanent job. And I didn't, you know, when you live in New York, you're kind of siloed. And so a lot of the areas of the West Coast were just these magical places that I had heard of, but didn't really have a geography, you know, in my head or of a lot of them, like, you know, Death Valley, Yellowstone, these like places that I knew from photography mainly. So I got this job in San Luis Obispo, which is between San Francisco and Los Angeles on the coast. And I was teaching photo history along with, you know, other classes, but I was teaching a photo history class, and I was showing these Western pictures of the dunes. And I realized that this place I had seen the name Oceano that was in the caption of the Western photos on the freeway, not far from where I was living. So I said, oh, I have to go see this mythical place. I had no idea, you know, where it was, but here it is. I'm right there. So I started talking to colleagues and saying, oh, you know, how do you get there? And what do you do? Because I was so new to the place, and I started learning there was a lot of other things going on these dunes. So I took a ride down there, and you can drive your car right onto the beach where the dunes are, is what I learned. So I took my car and drove on the beach, and it was not the pristine, modernist, empty wilderness space that I had expected. It was this overrun ATV, RV village with screaming motors and diesel fumes and sand kicking up everywhere and wind, because wind creates the dunes. So it was windy and there was like sand in my lip gloss immediately, kind of thing, like my night lip gloss, like lip balm, and it was, not at all what the, construction of photography can lead you to believe a place would feel like, this quiet, meditative place. So I was a little heartbroken and stunned and intrigued also, because I thought, how could this land use come to be? How could this place become, this beautiful, amazing natural landscape become this overrun by humans, and the land, it was just evident that the ecology was being destroyed, and there had to be a lot more going on here, because this couldn't be okay with everybody. So that was kind of the first meeting I had with the dunes. And then I started to research more, and I was talking with a colleague, and she mentioned the Dunites to me, and I was, the Dunites? What are the Dunites? Yeah. And so she said, oh, you haven't heard of the Dunites? And so it turns out also around the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there was a colony of artists, poets, mystics, people that thought that this place had a spiritual energy, or a creative vortex energy. Astrologically, it was this very powerful place, the way that the stars aligned and this geographic location. So a number of people started to squat, we would say today. They built sort of salvage wood shacks and were living out there. It was the Depression. So they took themselves to this place and lived off the grid there. And it was a little community. But what became the sort of hook for me was one of these Dunites was the grandson of President Chester Arthur. I think he was our 21st president. And his grandson's name was Gavin Arthur. And he came there to build a proper cabins and house an artist colony. And he thought, this high vibration site would be a place he wanted to bring all of these creative people. So he built these proper cabins. He invited people like John Steinbeck and John Cage and Edward Weston. And Edward Weston stayed in these cabins when he made the photos that brought me to this place. And, he was the grandson of a president. So he had a trust fund, and he had his mom sending a case of champagne and a case of whiskey every month to the dunes. And he was having these big bonfires with people, and they would have these conversations about the day and the politics of the day. And so, in the 30s, it was the rise of Hitler and fascism. And so they decided to publish a magazine from the dunes that was going to simulate these conversations they were having around the dune fire. And it was called Dune Forum. And this magazine had covers by Ansel Adams and Chandler Weston. Edward Weston did photographs. There was poetry inside. There was editorials about politics and things like that. So I was pretty intrigued by this artist community and this colony and the tie to Weston. And then I started researching and finding out what was going on with the writers and the writing community and how this came to be. And the controversy I discovered around it was not just the ecology that was being disrupted and destroyed, and that there's all these endangered species there, but that the neighboring communities were having a public health crisis. The dust that's generated by the grinding of the sand under the wheels of the ATVs every day turns the sand into dust, and then that's carried by the wind to the neighboring communities. And it's these little tiny, they call them PM10s, and they're fine particulates that are as fine as smoke that get lodged into the lungs. And I think it's more days than not in a year, the neighboring communities have the worst air quality in the nation from this dust. So there's been court battles about closing down the riding area for decades now, or almost 2 decades. They've been battling about who gets to use this land, how it gets used, and it's a multi-million-dollar business, the ATV riding. So there's the business interest and the money behind keeping it open, and then there's the residents and their children with asthma and older people having heart and lung problems. And so that's when I decided I thought this was a project for me, that there was a lot of interesting tidbits and things that I thought, were interesting. But then when I found out that there was kind of this contemporary relevance and this issue that I wanted to bring to attention through photography history and sort of all the different ways of looking at photography, that's when I reached out and started working with the local Chumash tribe, because this is Chumash land originally, and unceded land. So then I reached out to the tribal chair of the Actahini Northern Chumash tribe. That's the tribe from this area, to talk to them about how to represent their continued presence in this land and sort of start there. And then I had all these pieces and had kind of figure out how to distill it down to a project. But that's kind of how it all began. And then 8 years later became the book.
Yeah, I mean, that history is so rich, but it also creates quite a daunting prospect in terms of, okay, how do you reflect all these 3 sort of iterations of the use of the land by the Chumash, by the Dunites, by the people who do the ATVs, and sort of crystallize it into a series of photographs.
Exactly.
Right? And create something that's sort of representative of the experience that is that kind of, it can't really literally tell the truth of each experience, but it can honor it in sort of an honest way. But it's still quite a daunting prospect for a photographer. So tell me about trying to sort of figure that out as you're making photographs.
And how do you photograph something that no longer exists? Like the Dunites, the whole reason that I wanted to include them, not the whole reason, but one of the reasons I wanted to include them was that they left no trace. And it was this in contrast to what's happening now, that's scarring the land and the people that live nearby. So, the way I decided to approach it was a little bit more conceptually rather than documentary, and more, I've in a lot of my work before this project, I'm interested in photography as a reflection on the medium itself and the history of the medium. I teach photo history. I was actually an art history major. That was how I came to being a photographer, was really through photo and art history was what hooked me. So I've always been interested in sort of reflecting on the history of the medium and how photography has shaped our culture. And so I decided to think about the different periods of history and the ways photography was used in those different periods. So with the Chumash and the Chumash family that I worked with, Mona Olivas Tucker, I'm not sure if I mentioned her name, who's a tribal chair, I wanted to think about the history of ethnographic portraiture and the history of photography and ethnographic portraiture. So I thought about using that, pushing against that modality and doing something that was, not having the family wearing regalia and trying, like Edward Curtis portraits that were constructions in and of themselves, but doing something that looked really contemporary and kind of pushed against that history. And then with the modernists and the modern history of modernism and Edward Weston and Ansel Adams' photograph there, like I mentioned, and others, that very male-dominated period of history, I wanted to push against that and make these black and white photographs that resembled the modernists, but turn them into negatives and have them in the book flipping back and forth between negative and positive and making you question, am I looking at a negative? Am I looking at a positive? And thinking about how those are constructions and using the medium to really turn it on itself and showing a negative to make you think about that this is not reality. This is a photograph. This is a photographic negative. This is construction right outside the frame. You could hear the ATVs screaming in the background. You could see kids sliding down a dune on a boogie board, and so they weren't these beautiful, pristine areas that we see in the pictures of Weston or of the pictures that I made. And then thinking about with the riders and the riding community, I wanted to reference the new topographics and the idea of the man-altered landscape. The exhibition was called, the 1975 exhibition at George Eastman House, was this turning point in landscape photography where, photographers started. I'm sure your listeners all know what I'm talking about, but as a professor, I always throw
share.
it all in. So yeah, it kind of changed the way that landscape photography was then made and could be made. So these landscapes that showed the effects of human interference, and those were all, I think, all still black and white, but I used color because I wanted to contrast with and make it contemporary. But I wanted to include these landscapes that look like a Robert Adams photo with the tire tracks that he has and the scars in the landscape. And so these kinds of scars from the ATVs riding. But also the riders had this kind of, there's this sort of bravado and hyper-masculine kind of conquistador, conquering the land attitude that you can feel out there. Loud music and fireworks go off at night on the weekends. People are shooting off fireworks. There's this atmosphere that I wanted to also capture in. And so with portraiture of the writing community, I was thinking about a couple different kinds of photo history. One being like the typology, like this is the writers, and August Sanders, like man with his machines or people with the tools of their trade, and photographing like the writer with their ATV or, their machine, and very different kind of frontal forward kind of portraits than what I was doing with the Chumash family to kind of make a distinction there as well. So I guess to answer your question, I kind of was thinking about how I could use photography to tell the story, and how I could use, have these 5 different things going on: the Chumash, the Dunites, the riders, the modernists, and what's the 5th one? Hold on a second. Oh, the Sphinx. I haven't talked about the Sphinx.
That in
a minute. But I could have these things kind of coexisting, but have distinction, and then have them be this conceptual way of telling the story of place, but also of kind of the contemporary issue, which I didn't want to photograph the residents who are the sort of victims of the public health crisis, because I thought that wasn't the kind of pictures I wanted to make, but I wanted to include them. And so in the book and in exhibitions, I include text about the public health crisis through the words and of the writers themselves. So the court proceedings that have been happening include an opportunity for public comment. So the writing community and the business community and the residents can speak about why they feel the writing area should be shut down, or why the writing area should stay open, or what they think could happen, and get a chance to speak to it's the Air Pollution Control District is who they were speaking in front of the board. So there's this public record of all these comments. So I included the comments from both residents and writers about this issue rather than photographs. So I did rely on text as well to tell the story, because there's only so much that I could do with photographs. I felt I thought that the text would kind of complement it.
Yeah. It's what's fascinating. There's so many fascinating aspects about the project. And one of the things that kind of brings up for me, is the idea of how photography was used to basically create the myth of a place. I mean, photographs were used to help create the national parks, and
exactly.
And to emphasize that these places are important and they should be valued by the people who live in this country. And it did that, but it also created a whole industry around that, right? Where people now travel by the thousands there every year. And that sort of pristine natural world just doesn't really exist for the most part. I mean, the waterfalls, the mountains, all those, the trees, much of that is still there, but it's not the same place. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that photographers, not all, but I think a good majority of photographers, is that they want to create images that reflect the spirit of what was once there, and not really kind of show what's really happening now. And I think that's sometimes to the detriment, mm-hmm. because I think it's really kind of important for people who really treasure these places to understand that we do have an impact, as much as the government is sort of held responsible to keep things in check in terms of balance. The popularity of these places and our decisions to go there by the thousands every year does change things. And to somehow absolutely acknowledge that and not sort of dismiss them. Because some of the comments that people had, because I was looking at some old newspaper coverage of the dunes from like 15, 16 years ago, and one of the comments, I read about that, maybe I even read it in your book, was the idea of, about the pollutants. It's like, well, if people don't like it, they should just move.
Yeah.
And right. And it's just, and that misses a whole lot. But again, mm-hmm. it's about sort of showing that, these places are wonderful and beautiful, but we also collectively have a responsibility to take care of it.
Absolutely.
And I like that the work is touching on that.
Yeah, I think that is a huge part of what I wanted to do with this, and not, sort of idealize any aspect of it. I think one of the challenges for me was, I clearly have an opinion about it, but I didn't want the book to be a rant or be an opinionated from start to finish, look at these bad people, look at these good people, or look at, this is the good old days when the Weston photographs were made or something, that wasn't what I wanted to do. And that was a big challenge throughout for me, is how do I respect the writing community and the people that were generous and kind enough to let me photograph them and include them in the project, and be respectful of that. But and how do I show that their families, they're people that are, maybe completely unaware of their impact. I mean, and I can't be completely unaware of the ecological impact, but unaware of maybe the impact on the neighboring communities, the children that come there with their parents, children have no culpability at this point, So it was that, but also not idealizing the Weston era. And, there was riding and cars on these dunes from the moment that cars were invented. And like you said, the tourism in any of these places changes the whole landscape. I did a project, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now, in China. I was invited to China to do a residency and go on this trip, which ended up, I didn't realize until I got there that the trip part was hosted by the Chinese government. So one of the artists that had invited me to the residency, and it was part of an exhibition that was going to be in a museum in China that was a private museum, but he still is, works for one of the universities in Beijing that is public, government art university, one of the most prestigious. But so his father was a government painter, and so he had these ties to this organization that was, or it maybe still is in I don't know, this arts organization, kind of like the NEA would be, funding something here. But it's a little different when it's Chinese government. So I get to the airport and there's this whole camera crew and TV crew, and we're part of this exchange with Chinese artists. There's 4 Americans and then 15 Chinese artists, and they take us to this mountain called Huangshan, and it's this resort on the top of a mountain. And if you've seen in Chinese restaurants, those like ink brush paintings of the mountains with the fog and the little philosopher, it was there. That was where we went. And so it's these gorgeous mountains, and this, like, all these Chinese painters are making these beautiful landscape paintings. But the reality was it was overrun with tourism. They were building more hotels by the minute. So the whole time you're there, you hear construction and banging and clanging, and the fences that look like they're wooden kind of logs, fences, are made out of some kind of plasticine, that looks like wooden fences. And the pollution and just on and on what was going on this place that's supposed to be this beautiful, contemplative, like historic landscape. And so I made a project about that when I was there as a guest of the government, which they only wanted part of. It was part of, they kind of archived part of the project. So they only wanted the part where I was showing the idealized, pristine, and then I had these, it was a video installation. It was a 3-channel installation, and there was 3 different kind of stories happening on the 3 different panels. They were hung vertically like ink brush paintings, scrolls. So this idea of like the idealized landscape and like man or human impact on the land, and how we picture that, or picture it in pictures, photograph it and represent it, has been something that I've been working on and thinking about for a long time. And that idea in this landscape, I think, was what came to me right away, because it's kind of what I've been thinking about. And I think that I also have been making a film, because I think there's so much of a story, it's such a narrative, and that was the challenge too with, making these photographs is, photography is the singular image, and this project is certainly not singular, and so how does one image or one group of images tell the story? And so it had to be a book, or it had to be a film for me to have the way that these things could interact and have a conversation with each other. And then the 5th piece of the project, the other media component, is also 100 years ago, 1923. Cecil B. DeMille, the sort of first blockbuster of Hollywood filmmaking, was the 10 Commandments film, the silent film version. And he set up for the first third or so of the film as a prologue, but it's about 45, 50-minute long prologue. And it's the story of the Exodus from Egypt, so the Pharaoh and the Jews, and he set up a Pharaoh's temple in the dunes. He built this huge set, about 30 stories high, and he built 21 enormous plaster sphinxes that lined the walkway that would lead to the Pharaoh's temple, and had, I think, 3,500 people, extras and actors out there, and even more animals for them, the set. And for a summer, he filmed this film out there. And actually, some of the Dunites were extras, because it was around the same time they were there. And then when he finished filming, he dug a trench in the sand and he buried the entire set in the sand. And so under the sand is this Pharaoh's temple and sphinxes and all this little ephemera from filming, the costumes and pieces of things. And so another filmmaker, Peter Brosnan, in the 80s just discovered this story and wanted to go out there and make a documentary about digging up the film set, the lost city of Cecil B. DeMille. And he spent years trying to get permits and raise funds to go out there and do this. And of course, it's Chumash land. So then he was working with the Chumash, because they have sensitive cultural sites there that can't be disturbed. And eventually he got some permitting to do some digging and pulled up a piece of a sphinx. And this, he made a great film about this. So this prompted the Dune Center, which is a local nonprofit, to work with him to raise more money, or not necessarily with him, but in following his work, building on his work, and did another excavation in, I think it was 2017 when I started this project, or 2018. I was photographing and working with them when they were doing this second excavation, and they pulled up a huge piece of a sphinx. And now they're building a museum for this sphinx, and they have their little Dune Center, History Center museum, but then they needed a larger space for it because the sphinx is so huge. So they're trying to build a larger space. And so this idea of media history being treated as though it's, Egyptian artifacts, ancient artifacts, and restored with art restorers. And it was $140,000 to excavate this Sphinx the second time. And they only got 5 days worth of permits and funding to get only a piece of a Sphinx. So that whole aspect of photography, media, film history, that's also part of this landscape. And actually right now there is, I think it's a Apple TV, they're filming a film out there. They have a whole film set up right now in the dunes. And Pirates of the Caribbean with Johnny Depp, they filmed parts of it out there. So it's been used for Hollywood quite a bit as well. And so I love this connection to like the height of media artifice and Hollywood, the myth maker and progenitor, using this landscape as well as ancient Egypt, as whatever they want it to be, also sort of feeds into that idea of each successive inhabitant sort of taking this landscape and making it their own and feeling like they're the first ones, or they have this ownership, or someone like Cecil B. DeMille could bury the set and not think about it and think that he was like leaving something that people would find later and think maybe ancient Egypt, he said this in a biography, that maybe ancient Egypt, people would find it later and think that ancient Egypt's territory, or what is it called, not kingdom, but extended as far as all the way across the ocean.
Well, there's a bit of hubris and ego there.
Yes, exactly.
The Chico Review is a 6-night retreat exclusively dedicated to the world of photo books. Founded by the Charcoal Book Club, the annual event is a unique opportunity for you to network with some of the industry's best publishers, editors, and photographers to help facilitate publishing your photographic projects. The event provides valuable networking opportunities, critique sessions, and for one photographer, a prize that includes worldwide publishing of their project through the Charcoal Book Club. This year's event will include the participation of photographers including Sally Mann, Sage Sawyer, Mark Powers, Dana Luxembourg, and Todd Heido, among many others. Find out more by visiting chicoreview.com. I work at the Huntington Library, and as we're recording this is a Native American History Month. And one of the botanists, along with someone from communications, gave us a tour because there's an extensive collection of plants that exist on the gardens. And what they did is they walked us through different areas of the gardens where they were like plants that had been used by the Native Americans, largely in California, in a variety of different ways. There's foods, this medicine for materials, and it was really kind of fascinating to see how these things that I walk by every day were used practically. And one of the women, she wasn't the tribe that she's from is from middle of the country, but she still spoke to the idea about the relationships that the native peoples have with the land and the way that they use the different substances and plants and because they're reliant on that for their lives, they feel there's a connectedness to it that goes beyond merely just the spiritual. And then when the Dunites come, it's like they have a connection to it, but it isn't very much, not exactly the same thing. They get a sense that there's vibrations here. Mm-hmm. Other people have. I was on Joshua Tree and there was a word for it. I forget. Certain points have like PowerPoints or something like that. And then you get to the people with the ATV. They really don't have any really connection to the place other than the way they want to use it. And it just sort of the breadth of how people are connected or not connected to a place. And one of the things that I saw in the piece that I saw from 15 years ago, one of the things that the guy who was being interviewed was emphasizing was just his relationship with his family there, because he had been doing it for at least when he was a kid, and now he's bringing his kids out there. So it was more about it. This was a space for his family to have an experience, but not so much a connection to the place as something to be valued. And I think it's really kind of interesting to what I liked about, going through the book and then doing the research leading up to the interview was just seeing that perspective, right, about how nuanced and how diverse the reasons people give for a place being important to them. And I think we kind of often lose sight of that. And that each of them has a validity to it. Mm-hmm. But it also can be a point where it becomes so polarizing that it's hard to recognize that each group of people is valuing it for different reasons. And if it's not the same reasons that I have, then somehow you're wrong.
Well, I think that was what I saw as this like microcosm or this parallel to everything that's happening in our nation. It was 2016 when I started this. And so that was the first election that we were kind of stunned by. So I saw the same attitude of, not being able to see beyond your own point of view. And I think that was something that I wanted to make sure that I represented in the book, is that these family connections to the land are valid for the Chumash. They're valid for the writers. They're the photography history and photographer, our connection to this land through our modernist heroes. All of these things are valid, just different. And then there's the consideration, though, of is the value of someone's recreation equal to the value of someone's health, and should that be prioritized, is kind of the question that is brought up in the courts and has been ruled on and overturned and appealed and over now. So, but I think that that when the people who are from the writing community say, well, I came here with my grandparents and now I'm bringing my grandchildren, and that's a long history. That's 6 generations or something. So, and the people that are local and have been, families have been local, have been using this land for generations. But if the writing were to be shut down, that doesn't cease their ability to come with their family to this land. Just they can't ride their ATVs on it, so there's still car camping and those kind of things that are not being questioned as far as land use. And it's a state park and there's still access. It's actually 18 miles of coastal dunes and about 22,000 acres. And 6,000 of the acres are wildlife refuge and still have this very pristine quality to them. And then there's this 5-mile stretch of the beach that is where cars are allowed to go. And so the writing community says, well, we've already been, squished down to this small little area, because before the 80s, there was no regulation as to where riding could go. They could ride all over the entire area. And then there's oil there. So that became a complicated claiming of who could drill for oil and the land use around that. And then there was a nuclear power plant they wanted to put on the dunes, because as far as real estate goes, they felt that this land was unusable, so it was not valuable for any financial reason. So that why don't we just put a nuclear power plant on there? So there was environmentalist Kathleen Goddard-Jones and others that worked tirelessly to stop the nuclear power plant from being put there. And the concession was that 5 miles would go to state parks to be a vehicular recreation area, and then this 6,000 acres became a wildlife refuge. And so there's been these wranglings for decades and decades about land use, and there was drilling. There was a big not an oil leak, but a leak of a substance that is used to lubricate the oil rigs, the pipeline. And this this chemical for 40 years. There was a slow leak of this chemical into the land and into the ocean. And so for the past, it was 14 years when I made the book. So probably now 15 years or maybe more. The family, the Northern Chumash family, has monitors that are part of this remediation effort. Now it's Chevron. It was Unical, and Chevron had bought it, that is responsible to restore the landscape to the pre-drilling, sort of native landscape. The lawsuit, made them responsible to make it right in that way. So that there's this whole area that used to be for drilling that is now becoming revegetated and is more native and wild than other areas. And so I forget how I just got on that, but I guess the idea of the riders or people being able to commune on this land or be able to have their family legacies or histories, there's lots of land. They don't need to ride. Well, there's lots of land, but the riding area, if it were to be shut down completely, that wouldn't preclude people from being able to use this land. This is still, hiking, camping, all of those things can still happen without the grinding of the sand. Yeah. But their argument is that we've already been squished down to this little area. That was how I got on that. Sorry, we've already been squished down to this little area, and let us have just this left. But actually, during COVID, riding was shut down, like everything, and they did air quality testing, and the air was very clean. So there's this argument by the riding community that the air quality is from other reasons. It's not because of the riding, the agriculture, or it's this or other reasons why the air quality is poor. But it's really. Causality is really difficult to prove with people's health, to say that this is the reason this person has lung cancer or this is the reason this person has this breathing or heart issue is because of the dust in the air. It's so many other factors that.
Yeah, and it's quite a daunting thing to prove, when moneyed interests are pitted against people whose health is at stake and don't have the kind of funds.
Yeah.
Especially collectively, to be able to have a strong enough voice to really establish the strength of their issues, especially in the courts.
Exactly. And the people that do show up who have the time and the ability to voice these concerns are often the retired community that live there, which is not the entirety of the community. There's lots of families, there's lots of farm workers, and lots of children. I think it put this quote in the book, but one woman said, as a public comment in the court, she said, I went to my hairdresser, Supercuts, and she told me that she went to pick her daughter up at school one day at the Dorothea Lange Elementary School, because this is Nipomo, where the migrant mother was photographed. So there's another little piece of photo history that I couldn't figure out how to get into this project. But so she said, I went to the Dorothea Lange Elementary School to pick up my daughter, and I went to the nurse's office, and there were so many inhalers in the nurse's office in the drawer. When we went to try to find my daughter's inhaler to bring her home, it took 15 minutes to find my daughter's inhaler because there were so many in like the whole elementary school. And so that's not normal for an elementary school, for these kids to have, so many kids to be using these inhalers for their, and I think that just, you think about the kids that are there with their families riding every weekend who are, out there as well. They're breathing it in too. And so, not their choice.
There's so many vested interests in this. And then, you have all these images, you have all this text, and, there's the challenge of one being able to put a body of work together that's really kind of, that works just as a collection of photographs, right? And then it's also the fact that you're trying to be respectful of the different points of view. And it's like, no one's going to be completely happy.
No.
Right. So I can imagine that it can be quite the struggle. It's struggle enough to try and finish something, much less put the burden of what this person's going to think, what this person's going to think.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that struggle and what kind of choices you had to make to finally see it through.
I definitely wanted to work with the community members from start to finish in some way, so that, I live in this community, teach in this community, and I didn't want to have to, hide the book from these people, or, I want to be able to share it with the community. And so from the beginning, I worked with the Dunite historian, Norm Hammond. I didn't talk too much about how I included the Dunites in the project, but I included little stories about their lives and excerpts from their letters. One of them, his letters to another Dunite during World War II, who was stationed in Europe, and he sent letters from the dunes. And Norm Hammond has a lot of these letters, so I took some excerpts to talk about life in the dunes at that time. And so that was the other text component, and then photographed some of the objects that Norm has in his collection from Dunite artworks and ephemera. And so I worked from the beginning with Norm to try to figure out how to represent the Dunites in the best way and in an accurate way. There's also romanticizing of the Dunites that today, they might just be thought of as homeless people living in the dunes, and we have a very different way that we treat homeless people today. So, I wanted to work with him to accurately represent them in a way. And so he and I chose objects to photograph. He shared letters with me, shared different things, poems over the years. And then I gave him kind of a final edit of what I wrote and what I included, and not an edit over the photographs, but I also included him in the book, and a photograph of him in the book, a portrait of him. Because I feel like he, being the archivist, is very much a part of the story of the Dunites, because, again, how things are recorded, who's recording them, is of interest to me on how a story is told. And I'm playing a part in that, but I'm also wanting to sort of include and incorporate and recognize that this is a story that you're being told, and this is a perspective, and the people who are the recorders of history get to tell you and record the history the way that they see it. And so similarly with the Chumash, I wanted to make sure that I worked with the tribal chair and her family, because they have currently sort of the public relations face of the tribe, I would say. But also, I wanted to be really cognizant of ethnographic histories and that, I'm not Native, and I'm incorporating this story, and it's not my story, but I'm, again, the storyteller. And so I wanted to make sure that they were part of telling the story. And we spent a long time figuring out what kind of pictures to make, and what we came up with was to have her family in the dunes doing things they've been doing for generations, fishing, clamming, teaching their children these traditions. And I also had asked Mona and her son, they wrote an essay for the book so that their voice and their relationship to this place could be represented. And they do talk a lot about a connection to this place that goes back, more than 10,000 years, but is about something greater than themselves, greater than just ownership of land, but the land itself has its own agencies or its own sort of needs. And so, trying to make sure I worked with the community to represent them in a way that they wanted to be represented, not just accurately, but let them have a say. With the writing community, I was really upfront with people about what I was doing when I was making the photographs with them and asking for their permission. I sent books to people after it was completed. They were in the project, and they gave me their contact information, and it was still good years later. And, it's still, I'm sure that it's not going to be, the way that people on every side would do it themselves. I also worked with a woman and others, but a woman named Rochelle Tody, who's the founder, I think, or co-founder of the Concerned Citizens for Clean Air and resident organization to try to mitigate the dust and have cleaner air for the community. And so I sent the comments and the things that I was going to include in the book to her and asked her opinions and worked with that part of the community. So I tried really hard to not just go it alone and see, I think this will work. I think this is okay. But to pull in all of these voices. But in the end, like I mentioned at the beginning, I see it as a conceptual art project. And so it's not a documentary project. I didn't feel it had to be inclusive and, have documented fact about every aspect. But I wanted it to be intriguing and I wanted the pictures to be good. So sometimes the pictures guided the direction I was going, because I would make some pictures and I'd say, oh, I like these pictures a lot better than these other pictures. I think I'm going to try to make more of these pictures and see how I can do that. And played with photography and I wanted to see where I could take that, and my goal is always to push myself to be a better photographer. And so I shot for a lot of years, and I think that there's maybe only one or two pictures out of the 70 so pictures in the book that are from before 2021 or so, because I threw out everything from the early pictures as I went. But that's not true. I did shoot these pictures in the Mission Museum. That was the other thing I wanted to talk about, the recorders of history and who's telling the story. And so for your listeners who aren't familiar with California history, there was the mission system. And the missions, the 1780s or so, Spanish missionaries came over to California and enslaved the Native Americans who were living here and built these big churches and indoctrinated them. A lot of people died from disease that they caught from the Spanish, that they weren't used to these germs, and they stripped them of their land and of their language, of their culture, and taught them the way that they thought they should live. And so there's this very brutal history, and they have a little museum in the local mission in San Luis Obispo with a room in their church. Several rooms is their little museum, and one of the rooms is Native artifacts and mural and different things talking about how they taught them how to farm and how they made them have a better life. And so I wanted to photograph some of these objects and include this idea of not only the museumification that they're implying that these people are, gone and this was history, but also who's recording history and what stories were being told. So I also photographed some objects there. So I had to work with the mission and the church and those people to make those photographs, and the History Center in San Luis Obispo, and all different people that I pulled in. But yeah, I think that probably more than answered your question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Before we close, I have a technical question, and just in terms of the challenges of photographing in a place where there's fine sand and dust. It can wreak havoc on equipment. And
moisture and humidity.
So how do you sort of contend with that, especially after photographing there for such a long period of time?
Yeah, well, my tripod's pretty rusty, but it's a workhorse, old, huge, heavy tripod. But I would just wipe down my light stands and everything, and wash everything down and dry it and clean it really well after using. But I would keep a plastic bag around the camera when I wasn't using it, and keep it inside of my jacket, kind of tucked in, and then just take it out to make a picture. And then the rubber part kind of all came off, like it has that kind of rubber handle. I shot with a medium format digital camera for the pictures out in the dunes. But yeah, I wasn't taking it into the windiest parts of the dunes that often, but I did, to make the black and white pictures, I did have to go out in those winds. But I try not to be out there on the days with the highest winds, because it's just really impossible and unpleasant. But yeah, it was not good for the equipment. It was, yeah. I don't really have any tips other than a plastic bag and
hey, tried and true.
Dedicating one tripod, not, and one or two light stands if you need two, and then with the lighting gear, I wouldn't bring out like really good stuff. I was using smaller, like little speed lights. So they were, smaller, less expensive things. And yeah, when I photographed, I actually photographed with Mona, the tribal chairs, her whole family one day. I did a big family portrait for them as like a gift, not necessarily for the book, but then I ended up using it kind of with her essay in the back of the book because I wanted to include everybody who was helpful. And so I wanted to have them in the book, but it wasn't like one of my photographs for the book. So I needed more lighting and more equipment for that because it was a really big group. So I brought an assistant, had her like covering everything and keeping everything as clean and safe as possible. And we were standing in this one area where I had like my ankles. I got completely bitten by sand fleas. Yeah, that was, yeah. So then I was like afraid the equipment had all these bugs in it. So we really cleaned it. It was down on a blanket on the sand. Yeah.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend a photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Oh my gosh, I should have been prepared for this one because I do listen to your podcast, but I did not think about that. One photographer. There's so many. I've been looking at a lot of different kinds of photography lately because, and we talked about this previously, but I've been photographing a lot with my daughter, who's now 3. And so I've been looking at a lot of photography from domestic, kind of different, very different than this landscape and historical kind of stuff. And I mean, she's not obscure. Everyone probably knows her work, but Eleanor Carucci, I've been looking always at her, and she just always astounds me how she makes these such personal pictures throughout every stage of her life, but they're so relatable in a universal way because it's a specific subsect of our society. Not everyone's experience, but a lot of the experiences are common to all humanity of love and aging and family and anxiety and all of these things that are just a part of the human experience and are so personal to her and so vulnerable. And she's so brave that she puts herself out there like that. And I really admire her for that. And her pictures are always stunning and beautiful. I love her use of red. She always has crazy pops of red and dark, dramatic light and severe light about these, things that are very emotionally charged. So not obscure, and I know you've had her on this show, and everyone probably knows her work already, but she's the one that popped into my head for whatever reason today.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your time this morning. I really, really appreciate it. Really have enjoyed discovering a place that I knew very little about, but having a much greater appreciation than I anticipated I would have. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope that I didn't just talk too much about Oceano and not other things, because I know there's a lot of other things we could have kind of branched off and discussed on all these topics, photo related and otherwise, but there's so much to say that once I start going. That's good. I'm happy with it. Okay. Thanks so much for having me, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks to Lana for joining us. And if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area next year, you'll be able to attend an exhibit of Lana's work at the Harvey Milk Center beginning on January 25th through March 1st. You can learn more by visiting our website at lanazcaplan.com. And if you're a fan of our work, you can write reviews on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts on, and share a favorite episode on social networks, be it X, Facebook, or Instagram. Remember to use the hashtag #TheCandidFrame. You can also support us financially via Patreon. If you want to make a one-time donation to the show, you can do so now by visiting buymeacoffee.com/thecandidframe. Thanks to John Agather for his recent contribution. We've relaunched our newsletter using Substack. Sign up today to receive regular updates on all things related to TCF. And if you can't find every episode of the show on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts on, download the Candid Frame app, available for Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.